afternoon. Okay, we'll try it one more time. This is a live environment. Good afternoon. This is not virtual. We are real. My name is Betsy Corcoran. I'm co-founder and CEO of EdSurge. I'm very happy to have you here in a real conversation about virtual stuff. We have a great panel, and because we spent a little time saying it's really hard to have this conversation without seeing anything, before I introduce our people and we jump into the conversation, we're going to show you 3 short video clips of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So, roll clip number 1, please. Going 1, twice. Here we go. That was Filament Labs. Next up, I believe we have a clip, a short clip from Microsoft. All these clips are 1 or 2 minutes, so they're pretty short. So we can roll clip number 2.
I was tired of preparing kids for yesterday. We were always preparing kids for this world that didn't really exist anymore and that wasn't going to exist when they graduated. And I wanted to get my kids to the point where they could actually build the future.
We've seen a fundamental shift already in how a lot of educational resources are being delivered. We've seen a shift from print books through to ebooks. And I think the next evolution of that is from books to mixed reality.
As I started preparing my lectures and thinking how I'm going to communicate this to the students, one thing I wished is I had a 3D chalkboard.
You actually have all these tools that allow students to generate content for other students, which means that you could have students that are subject matter experts informing the development of experiences to help teach content that they're learning about in their other classes. And that's just amazing.
With the HoloLens, our idea for an app was if you didn't have access to all different instruments, you could learn them. I feel like being able to interact with something is what makes you remember it more.
I'm a visual learner. I'm someone who learns by experience as opposed to just reading it out of a book. And so having the HoloLens put that visual in front of you makes things much easier.
We could use mixed reality for agriculture,
science classes,
geography.
Math would be a big one.
It provides a much more engaging experience for students, and that's the ultimate goal for a teacher, is to engage the students and have them learning.
Okay, that's Microsoft. Thank you. And, okay, and we have one more clip.
Transfer VR's precision measurement
This
is an immersive
is an
learning
absolute
providing
game
students with
changer.
hands-on
I've just been on the train
that
for
they
3
will
hours
use on
and
the
I could
job
not take
in
it
the
off.
real
It is
world.
incredible.
After
So this is
trainees
it,
log in,
the
they
Microsoft
move at their own pace
HoloLens.
through the learning simulation.
I've attached it to my laptop.
Each simulation begins with instruction to introduce a measurement tool and related concepts. During the instruction, the trainee interacts with the virtual coach to demonstrate initial understanding. The trainee then demonstrates their knowledge through hands-on practice. As the trainee answers correctly, they earn experience points. Each correct answer in a row adds to a trainee's streak. Trainees must earn enough experience points and complete a 5-answer streak to complete the simulation. Trainees earn bronze, silver, or gold badges based on their performance in the simulation. Trainees' progress data is stored and available for instructor review outside of VR. When a trainee completes all of the simulations, they are ready to demonstrate their knowledge in the real world.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. And our fourth panelist, Nori from Japan, could you share, his work is so new they don't have a video yet. They are just starting it. So just take one moment and explain a little bit about what you're doing with AR, VR in assessments.
Okay, so my name is Nori. I flew in from Tokyo, Japan. Basically what we do in Japan is we provide prominent assessment solutions to the Ministry of Education. And also we work closely with the largest English aptitude test in Japan, which has about 2.4 test takers. So how we are going to use these XRs is that we have two initiatives at this moment. One is to use and see the possibility of using VR in assessment, especially in the English communication skills where the interviews are necessary. And the second usage of the VR where we're looking at is that another ministry that we work closely in Japan is the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, where they have a newest initiative called EdTech and Future Schools. So we're trying to look into how VR can be utilized in the normal classroom settings, as well as maybe in the future, classroom itself can be inside the VR. So these are the two initiatives that we're looking into.
Perfect, thank you very much. So as a longtime technology journalist, I've had a chance to interview lots and lots of entrepreneurs. And an entrepreneur once gave me, I thought, the best description of what an entrepreneur is. He said to me, I get a lot of tickets for going through red lights. And I said, okay, you clearly have a problem. You go through red lights all the time. Why do you do this? He said, because I'm always looking 2 blocks down the road at the next red light. And so I miss the red light in front of me. So that difference between imagining what the future is going to be and what it currently is what this panel is about. All right? So where is my leaping whale? This is the question that I have. We've been talking about AR and VR for a little while now. So I'd like to talk about the difference between what we imagine will be the leaping whale in the classroom and things like that, and where we are. How distant are we between what we can do and that leaping whale? Ronnie, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I was going to ask Dan from Microsoft, since that's an AR, since the leaping whale is an AR thing. You get to go first.
All right, great. So the leaping whale. So I think we've really just begun to scratch the surface as to what it can do, right? I think, and we talked about this, I think, amongst ourselves a little bit, where there are a lot of these expectations of what the technology is going to do and how amazing it can be and how immersive it can be. I actually would go so far as to say I think we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice with that for a couple of reasons. One, people see things like that, they see Ready Player One, and that's immediately to where their heads go to, like, that's where the technology is today, that's where what I can do. And then they put this headset on and they go into a very magical, fantastic experience that does not look like what they expected from some of this media. And there's a bit of a, oh, this is cool, but I thought it was going to be something else. I think the other thing I would add to that from an educational standpoint that has done a disservice is a lot of time has gone into those, what I call showcase experiences. Go down in the Titanic and check it out, or things like that, that don't necessarily have educational value, that aren't aligned to standards and aren't helping educators do what they need to do with the technology. And that hasn't necessarily been helping either, because what I've seen is educators try on that device, they see that, it's like, yeah, this is cool, but that's not helping me teach what I need to teach. So I think there is a bit of a disconnect between those expectations right now.
Right. We have 2 Dans on this panel, so
keep it easy.
Dan and Phil, just to make sure I can keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think first of all, it's important to distinguish between VR and AR when we talk about what's been delivered versus what is still firmly in the world of hype. And the whale is an AR phenomenon, and while we're not there yet, we are, I think, at that point, which is the point of presence with VR. in VR right now, you can go in and you can feel like you're someplace completely different, and that's a really powerful phenomenon, right? It's kind of, and in many ways, I like to think of it as like diorama 2.0. Right, like there's something really powerful about getting off the couch, going to a museum and standing in front of a diorama and feeling like you've been transported to another location or another time. And VR absolutely delivers on that right now. But we also have our whales in VR. I suppose we want to continue that idea, and movement is definitely a big one, right? Like anything that pulls you out of being present in that other space is a whale. And right now, if you need to move from point A to point B, it's going to be a hack. You're probably going to teleport. If you don't teleport, you might vomit. You know, so there are some issues to be worked out there, and there are a couple different technologies that are working to enable people to walk in virtual space right now. They're all extremely silly looking. And so if you have any shred of pride, you probably won't use them. And they're also just impractical for a number of other reasons as well. But so there are, on the VR side of the equation, there are still a number of technological issues to work out. But I do think it's important to point out that I think the presence promise has been delivered.
Presence promise is delivered. Yeah. Ronnie, what do you think?
Sure. So just real quick, by show of hands, does everyone know what we're talking about when we say the whale? I'm assuming everyone does. Does anyone not?
So there's a very famous Magic Leap video that shows a collection of kids in the auditorium. And they're on the basketball court, and they're sitting there, and all of a sudden this amazing whale just leaps out of the floor. And it was with that whale leap that Magic Leap raised hundreds of millions of dollars to kind of start really developing a lot of these XR kinds of technologies. Thank you.
And so the whale captured a lot of people's imagination. For us, we're in workforce development at Transfer VR. So our leaping whale, as it were, is that everybody gets a job and they perform well on their job. And to answer your question about how far are we from that version of the leaping whale, we are very far. We are years away from that. Not because the technology doesn't exist, but because the technology hasn't really propagated or isn't readily available to everybody in everybody's hands. So we do workforce job training simulations in VR. With a small group of companies because we just started, but what we've noticed is we did look at the Microsoft AR technology, the HoloLens, and we ultimately ended up going with the Oculus Rift for price reasons, because for the jobs that we were training for, it was just less expensive to buy an Oculus Rift than the HoloLens, but the prices are coming down is where I'm going with this. And so because the price of all these hardware is coming down, when we first started, it costed like, $1,500 to get started. Today it's $400. That makes it a lot more likely for us, for that whale, that magic whale as it were, to become a reality for most folks. So this concept of the pre-apprenticeship program in VR is what we're trying to scale, and we think we can get there, but it'll take a few years.
Okay. So let's talk about the next year, the next 12 months. So I'd love to hear from each of you over the next 12 months. What do you see your technology delivering, or the assessments? What do you expect the experience in a classroom will be of someone using your technology literally in the next year? Dan, you want to?
Sure, yeah. I'll focus on the AR side, since we have a couple of folks on the VR side. We have a VR solution as well as an AR solution. So what do I expect in the next 12 months? I would, similarly to what you were just saying, I would say continued adoption. We're starting to see it pop up more and more in classrooms. And I think there's
And what are they using it for in classrooms? I mean, be real specific.
Sure, so using HoloLens in particular, medical, it's being used a lot to teach medical anatomy.
Okay, so in medical schools at a higher level.
And even within, we're even seeing them show up in secondary schools as well. And anatomy is a really big thing that it's being used for, I think, for a couple of reasons. I think AR and VR each have different strengths, right? I think one of...
And maybe we should pause for a moment.
Sure.
Should we define AR and VR, the difference between the two? Let's do that. So why don't you define AR, and then we'll let other people define VR.
Sure, yeah, no, good catch. So basically what the HoloLens does, it's an augmented reality device that still gives you full spatial awareness. So you see holograms in your field of view. So for example, if I had one on my head right now, I could still see everybody in this room. But there could be holographic displays over it. So you still have full awareness within a classroom versus VR, which is completely immersive. So what that lends in a classroom scenario is a lot of, you've got the mobility because it's fully self-contained. So you can walk around entirely, you can see one another, and classes can work together on problems at the same time. So I think that next 12 months, we're going to continue to see it being adopted more and more, because I think we're starting in both with AR and VR, you're starting to see more success cases that I think is getting away from some of the skepticism. I have heard on both cases, like, where's the research that shows that this is better than traditional classroom or other methods? And I think as time goes on, you're starting to see more of those wins in both cases, both for AR and VR, that's helping to drive adoption.
Excellent, and we are coming back to this outcomes in education question, don't worry. Dan, filament. So any other definition you want to add of a VR, and then again, what's going to happen in the next year with your technology?
It's exactly what other Dan said. I mean, VR is very similar to AR, except you're more likely to lean on the virtual table and fall over or trip on something because you can't see it. Although next round of the hardware, I think, as I understand it, will have a forward-facing camera, so when you want to, you can toggle between the two. So next 12 months for filament. So we actually, as of literally this morning, found out that we're going to get $750,000 from the National Science Foundation to build out a robotics game. So the game they're going to be working on over the course of the next 12 months is basically a VR game designed to not supplant physical robotics kits, but to augment them, and in particular to create a smoother on-ramp toward robotics for a broader diversity of people. So that brings me to this broader idea of what happens in the next 12 months, and that is that, and in education at large, and that is that VR moves from being something that's relatively static or passive to something that's highly interactive. So when we first started to see VR enter the classroom, we saw things like Google Classroom, Google Cardboard, field trips where you would go someplace, maybe you'd stand on the wall of China and you could look around on 360 degrees, and then maybe you could start to experience those scenes in motion through 360-degree video. But ultimately, you are a passive consumer some other place and some other time. And my perspective on where VR is hopefully headed is that it's less important where you go, and it's actually more important what you do there, like any interactive technology. And so with Roboco, our entire mission with the game is to create something that allows you to explore design thinking by actually doing design thinking in a virtual space over the course of the next 12 months.
Okay, 12 months. How far will we get in assessments in the next year?
Sure. Okay, so of course, the pilot will already be starting.
Okay.
And because in terms of using VR in assessment, the scope is very, concrete. So what we want to do is we currently provide paper-based test and online-based test first, but a secondary test will be done interviewed. And using human beings as a human rater is quite expensive, as well as these human raters vary in their evaluation judgment. So using VR and replacing that is a very narrow scope that we think that is doable. And that's one area that we want to explore. But still, there are some hardware elements that we hope in the future will be implemented. For example, biometrics, because if you're talking about assessments, how do you prevent people from cheating? Like, for example, if you have eye tracking elements within the VR, maybe why don't you put the eyeless recognizer, where you can, identify certain people.
But just so that we're 100% clear, when you talk about doing a VR assessment, and it's primarily starting with language assessment at this point, so presumably you'd be assessing me in English or something. So just describe, how will that work? What's the scenario?
Sure. Okay, so you'll be put into a situation. Usually, English aptitude assessments have an alignment to CFR. CFR is called Common European Frame of Reference. And it gives you a situation where, for example, somebody comes up to you and asks, where's my car? Right. I kind of parked it, it's red, it's got to be somewhere around. So basically, VR takes the gyro, head position. And also, if you were to kind of pick up something, the VR will understand the position And also you have a microphone, you have a speaker, it's all there, right? So that's the kind of environment, immersive engagement environment that we want to give, because these paper-based interviews, where at this moment you kind of read out and describe what's in there, but that's not real world, right? So that's one that we'll be doing within 12 months. And also another one that we will be testing out within this 12 months will be how to use VR in classrooms. And also the second one will be more difficult. How do you create a classroom environment in the VR? And that's close to like Ready Player One situation. And having multiple people access at the same time with low latency.
Okay. Yeah.
So as you know, in Tokyo, Olympic is coming, so 5th generation network will be there.
Yes.
So we'll be using 5G to test out.
So you'll have a lot of bandwidth.
Right.
Okay. But you think we'll get this all done in a year?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It's a pilot. We're not making a product yet, okay?
Okay, no product, just a pilot.
Yeah.
All right.
One thing I would add to that is, so the cost of the hardware have come down a lot over the last few years. I think over the next year, the quality of the experiences will improve, and the quality is already pretty good. So we have this one bartender trainer that our clients use, and this one gentleman was in it. He was, probably a little over 50 years old. And he was using, he was making drinks in the bar, and I could see him like trying to lean on the bar, and I would tell him like, listen, there's no bar there. Like, please do not lean on the bar. And he was like, okay. So like 2 minutes later, he leans on the bar, and he falls flat on his forehead. And I like immediately like text our lawyer, and I was like, listen, this guy fell down. Like, are we gonna get in trouble? And so the quality is already good. But I think you'll see that, a couple years ago, people used to get sick in VR, get motion sickness. A lot of that has gone away. I think that will continue. I'm not sure how much the hardware price will go down much in the next year, but I think the real thing to pay attention to is 2 to 3 years from now. Okay. Because 2 to 3 years from now, one of the biggest kind of drawbacks of VR right now is that while it looks real, it doesn't feel real, like your hands. Like you don't have tactile, like when you pick up objects, they don't have the weight.
Feeling on the bar, yeah.
Correct, and people are working like on really fantastic solutions, sticky or smelly or whatever. But people are working on solutions, like haptic solutions, where you can start to feel the weight of things, or the objects that you touch in VR will feel like they do in real life.
Okay, so I love this scenario. We're going to have the guy training to be a bartender in your environment, and hopefully in 2 to 3 years you have a lot of lawyers, so when they do this, it's over, you're good. We'll start to get sticky. But what is this going to cost? Because gosh, can't I just go down to my local bar and train to be a bartender now? So how much is it costing per person to do this kind of training? And really, it's a question for all of you. How much is it going to cost per kid to make this kind of experience available?
So I know in our instance, the cost, because we do job training, it does depend on the job. So it costs a little bit more to train a nurse versus somebody who wants to be a welder or a HVAC type person. But generally speaking, the cost should come down by at least a factor of 10.
Okay,
right?
But what does it give us a number right now?
I think next year it's reasonable to get the cost to around $100 a student. I think 5 to 10 years from now it should be around 10.
Okay, $100 per student. Can you guys teach?
And I'm talking about just the knowledge basis. So like, how do you do things? Like, how do you run a lab, or how do you operate a crane, or how do you, how do you do the techniques that a phlebotomist does?
Okay, so this is the software side. This is not the hardware side.
This is not the certificate. Like schools will still charge money for their degrees and certifications, and this is not that. This is just to acquire the skills.
Just to acquire the skills.
Yeah, so on the hardware side, the costs are approaching the point where you could get a classroom set of devices for the same amount of money as a single smartboard. And smartboards have obviously not been, cost has not been the barrier to proliferation of smartboards by any means. So that's
so a couple $1,000 then.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple $1,000 or less. And in particular, I mean, part of our business case for the robotics game is that the cost for a robotics kit per student is hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. The parts get used up, the parts are not replaceable, the parts are finite, the parts break. Only one kid can be using the parts at a time. So there are definitely, I mean, right, like in any other field, there are advantages to working with virtual tools as opposed to physical tools from a cost perspective.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm glad you brought that up. Like a lot of times where we see, particularly among the early adopters, is where you compare it to the cost of teaching it today. And in many cases, yeah, it is vastly cheaper. Like even though, you look at it and you're like, oh wow, that sounds kind of expensive. When in the areas that are grabbing it today, when they counterbalance that to like how much does it cost us to teach it today, they are actually finding almost universally it's dramatically cheaper to go with a virtual solution.
Because, and what do they lose, what are they giving up that they don't have to pay for then?
So I always come back to the same example, I'm sorry.
Skeleton.
Cadavers, yeah. So like medical schools using HoloLenses, right? Like the cost of maintaining a cadaver lab is ridiculously expensive versus the cost of using a HoloLens. Not only that physical cost of maintenance, but when students get access to it, because they're so costly in medical schools, students often don't get access to it till like second year or something like that, because you don't want a bunch of first years carving up one of these expensive things. Those things go away. So what I'm seeing with both AR, augmented reality and virtual reality is those earlier adopters are comparing the cost versus the way of doing it today. So robotics is another great example for VR.
Can I also add to this?
Yes, please.
So not the classroom usage, right? So assessment, why do we use assessments, use VR in assessments? Why do we plan to use that? It's because we're providing an assessment which is highly endorsed by the government. So we are constantly facing the government's pressure saying, why does your test and assessment so expensive? And usually this cost comes from human raters. For example, interviewers. There's no one interviewer. There's usually two interviewers. But if you can replace that to VR and have a recorded voice and do that remotely, it just cuts costs. And that will benefit the test takers. So that's the business model that we're looking at.
So let's talk a little bit about use of AR and VR as curriculum and learning outcomes. And Dan, you kind of got us started on this, right? What are the learning outcomes that we are looking for? You can give me the cadaver example again.
I'll stay away from that one.
Let's just try something else. But how are we measuring the learning outcomes of this technology? And maybe, Barani, we should start with you, because at least you are trying to train people for a job, right?
Yeah, and so we are totally upfront with all of our customers, and everybody understands this. No one has done any real amount of research on using virtual reality in workforce development. So VR has been used in the military and all this stuff, and in games, blah, 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 but no one's actually proven that you can use virtual reality as a legitimate way to train someone for a job. So we are trying to do that, and we are in the process of conducting our own pilot studies and efficacy studies, and people are willing to take that risk with us because the current state of affairs in teaching and education and training is that people feel the education system is tapped out. Right now, about 50% of the people who graduate from high school are not going to go pursue a college degree. Those people still need to be employed. And so even though there's no real research basis for workforce development training in virtual reality, people are saying, we need to invest in this and try it, because this 50% of the population that isn't going to a 4-year program isn't going away, and we don't want them to become net consumers of social services. We've got to figure out how to get them to be contributors.
And when you say they're willing to take the risk, are they the employers? Are they the government? Are they the users? Who's we when we talk about willing to take the risk?
That's a great question. So the users are the easiest to convince. They put on the VR, AR headsets, and they're like, this is a zillion times better than PowerPoint. Please don't ever make me listen to a lecture ever again. Same with the trainers. I mean, when they see this, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have to stand up in front of a group of young adults and like pretend I'm like, entertaining when I'm not, So the people that are taking risk, definitely the employers are taking a financial risk. They're also taking like a credibility risk, because they're saying, hey, we're going to pilot this thing with this like small startup that nobody's ever heard of. And then definitely the government is absolutely taking a risk because they are spending taxpayer dollars to pilot our stuff, and obviously they can, if the media or anyone wants to go after them for spending money on unproven technologies, they can. So they're taking a reputational risk as well, I would say. But there's no, in terms of risk, there's no like danger, well, except for the guy who fell down while bartending. So there's a little bit of danger, but it's not life or death.
But now you've encouraged me to go back to the cadavers because, yeah, Dan, I mean, if you're going to train my doctor with VR, AR, am I going to have confidence? Is this going to work? What's the evidence?
So using the cadaver example, it is a combination. You still want that tactile notion, so folks are still using a combination. Where you do get to education, there are actually a number of studies that show the efficiency of using both AR and VR in classical education scenarios. And these are not like Microsoft studies. These are like peer-reviewed studies by like Harvard, MIT, Oxford, things like that. It's funny, I used to joke that no one would be shocked if I rolled up with a bunch of our own research that said this was fantastic. So we've just been pulling research from other people. And the facilities are basically doing A/B testing. So if you cut a class in half goes through a traditional curriculum and testing methodology, the other half goes through it with either an AR or VR device, and everybody takes the same test at the end of it. And then they're tested again several weeks later for retention. Like that's generally how it goes. At a high level, I'll give a high level and then some specific examples that we've seen. At a high level, we see numbers anywhere from 25 to 34% improvement in grades using AR or VR in educational settings versus traditional.
And for any particular slice or just
not across the board, not related to any specific subjects. Some more
math, English?
They've traditionally been done more around science.
More around science,
things,
okay.
Notions like that where you can actually get a little more active. A couple of precise examples, and I'll use cadavers for one of them. One university actually did 3 semesters of A/B testing before adopting the HoloLens, and they found that their students saw a full letter grade improvement when using the device versus traditional. And they've now adopted these devices into all of their courses. The cadaver example, there's a fun one where they were already completely convinced on the difference to grade, so they took a different tack. They wanted to see how much more quickly they could teach the same content using this, because they had already proven to themselves that they were seeing improvements in grades. And they actually found in A/B testing that they were actually able to get to almost equivalent grades in the two groups. They would define it as statistically insignificant, that the grades were almost identical, but in 60% less time using an AR device. So that's opening up now all kinds of fantastic conversations around what do you do from a curriculum standpoint if this holds. And this is like, we've done 3 rounds, we've got a few more rounds to go. But that has vast implications from a curriculum standpoint if you can teach the same amount of curriculum in that much less time.
So what shouldn't we do with AR and VR in education?
You're looking right at me.
I'm looking right at you.
Well, so I guess to bring it back to the whale, my big question after I saw that video was like, well, now what? Like, what happens now? So there's this concept of something called look and learn, which is like you look at a 3D object and somehow you learn something important about it. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of interactivity, but not just any type of interactivity, particularly embodied interactivity. So actually the video that you showed, I think, was like perfect. Like, these are all disciplines where part of the cognition is coming from the player's head and part of the cognition is expressed through the player's body, the performance of the task. There's an intelligence that lives in the actions that they physically take in the VR space, and that's where VR really, really shines, right? So in contrast, if somebody came to me and they said, I would like you to make a VR game about accounting, I would be concerned, because that's an entirely disembodied, purely cognitive exercise. There actually is a game called VR Accounting. It's nothing to do with accounting, trust me.
And what about literature then? I mean, should we read the Canterbury Tales, which you could argue is disembodied, or are we supposed to experience the Canterbury Tales?
Sure. I mean, so one of the examples that we showed in our reel is a game where you learn about the life and times of 3 famous female scientists, right? And so, of course, I would support the idea that there is value to actually being in Jane Goodall's tent and feeling present in the space that she operated in when she was doing her work, and that there's value from a learning perspective to having that experience. I'm just not making the argument that's the pinnacle of the technology or where I think we ultimately
Okay, so it's not great. I think we're going to have time for 1 or 2 questions. If we could have a quick mic up to the front, or you can stand up and you can shout, and I'll shout back for you.
So isn't the issue right now for virtual reality classroom content more than effectiveness? Like, you know, I use the example of if you could put the kids in the debates around the founding fathers, around the Constitution, they would have a different experience and remember it differently and remember more of it. And because I'm an evangelist for VR in the classroom if we can get the content, but we don't have that.
So the question is, do we have the content? So it would be great, and all these things are possible, but do we have the content?
I have an opinion on that.
I
think before you can have the content, you have to have the business model. I mean, I think if tons of people were making money on generating VR content, you'd have a lot more content developers. So I think part of the reason why there might not be as much content, well, part of it in the past was the adoption of hardware. That's changing, but I think now it's going to be about how are people going to make money, because if developers are making money, they're going to develop a ton of content for sure.
I mean, yeah, I agree. I think there's certainly a chicken and egg thing at play there. I have a couple of answers to that. I think there's content and applicable content, right? Like going back to that standards-aligned content, making sure that there's stuff out there that people can use. And then I would also argue content creation tools are somewhat lacking. I think, you know, I can go on forever about what I think are friction points to adoption. But right now, it is really hard for your average person to go ahead and create this kind of content. It is still somewhat bespoke. And I think that's another barrier to it as well. I do think the content's getting better and we're getting more standards-aligned content, which is really, really helpful. But I would love to see more the ability for anyone to create their own content in the space.
So the cost may come down. The content may get developed. It may get better. We may find that we have the ability to move. So my question is, what year are each of you dreaming of? What year, right? Will you have the AR, VR system that is affordable for the classrooms in our world? Pick your year. You got to think, and then just go 1, 2, 3, 4, pick your year. And you guys think about that too. Pick your year. Who's going to go first?
I'm going with 2040.
2040. Nori.
Assessment 2020.
2020. Brave. Okay.
6.5 years.
6.5 years. You're going to make me do the math on that one? Okay. 6.5 years. Right.
I have to go for months now. I'm going to say 2025.
2025.
And, and I would add to that, and that's where I think you start to get better artificial intelligence and machine learning woven into it as well, which is where I think you're really going to see the technology start to pop.
Message to you all, come back here in 2025 or maybe 2020, and we'll see where we are. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists.